Anyway, he hates these people. His boat was capsized, swallowed by a fish for 3 days, and vomited on a beach. Okay, I'll do it. You guys better repent. And, you're always going to destroy you. Well, they do. They do the exact opposite of what Jonah wanted and what he thought they would do. They all repented of their ways and started worshiping Yahweh. So the city was spared. Well, when you do some deep diving, the city of Nineveh worshiped this god called Dagon. Dagon was a fish god. He was half fish, half man. And when you look at the depictions, some of them show him looking like a merman. But then there's also depictions that shows this fish like curved upward with its mouth open, and then a man from torso up hanging out of the fish of the mouth. You don't tell me, you're not going to tell me that God didn't use some preconditioning there so the people would listen. The people seen Jonah get threw up out of a great fish's mouth. They thought it was Dagon himself. He allowed these false gods, these fallen angels, to parade around as this fish god for ever how many thousands of years, and then used it to his benefit to allow the people to be saved of Nineveh. When you look at the creation story, it talks about, him subduing chaos. His spirit hovered over the waters. That word is the Tahom. That is a cognate of the word Tiamat. And if you look into the Babylonian creation epic, their creation epic is that there was this chaos dragon named Tiamat. And that Marduk comes down and defeats this chaos dragon and uses her pieces to form and make Earth.
Ladies and gentlemen, here we are back again on the My Family Thinks I'm Crazy podcast, and with me today is a brand new guest, someone who hasn't been on the show before, but I have a feeling that this is going to be a new conversation that I am ready for and willing, and I think, I think this might change some people's opinions on what is wandering in the forest. But without further ado, Justin Brown, the host and creator of the Prometheus Lens podcast, which is available wherever you find this show, is joining me here for the first time. And it's not just the podcast that he's here to talk about. He's also finishing up his first book, which is titled The Epic of Esau. So, Justin, thanks for joining me, brother. Thanks for reaching out. Like I said before we got started, thanks for being patient with me. My family thinks I'm crazy too, and for more than one reason. Not just because I have some crazy ideas, also kind of a crazy person. But anyways, enough about me. Justin, for the audience who might not have tuned in before to your show, tell us a little bit about what they can expect from the Prometheus Lens podcast, and give us a little 101 on who you are.
Well, first off, just thanks for having me. I appreciate it. And as far as the scheduling conflicts, believe me, I know how it goes. It gets crazy, especially when you throw in family and work and things like that. So I'm completely understanding on that. So not a problem whatsoever.
Cool.
But my podcast, the Prometheus Lens, I started out podcasting about 2 years ago now. And it actually just started, just me and a couple friends would get together and talk about weird or crazy things in the Bible that you don't never hear pastors talk about, Nephilim giants and things of that nature. And we ended up just starting a podcast on it. But I've always been a huge history buff, and I love conspiracy theories and diving into just, various subjects like that. So where the first podcast, it was just, diving into the weird things of the Bible. So I wanted to just take it a step further. So I started a second podcast, and that was the Prometheus lens. But that show, I say that I use the Prometheus lens as an allegory to take a second look at everything. Because more times than not, when we take the time to investigate anything really that we are taught or told, we find out that it's a lot different when you look and read and find out for yourself. So I've just taken the opportunity to re-examine everything, and I kind of coined it the hero's journey. Off Campbell's work, you have to go into the unknown, slay the dragon, and rescue the damsel, and come out on the other end with a whole new perspective. So it's just a transformational journey of just looking at everything with a new set of eyes and investigating everything.
Yeah. From the perspective of the Bible, I can appreciate that as somebody who's been kind of lazy when it comes to all that. I think it's something, as I've gotten older, I've learned to appreciate more and be more grateful than I was maybe when I was a teenager for being raised as a Catholic, despite maybe some of the peculiarities, we'll say, of the Catholic Church. I do think that the Christianity that was presented to me throughout my life was a good force. It didn't manifest as a cult. It didn't manifest as somebody abusing or traumatizing. It definitely brought a lot of big ideas to my young mind and made me contemplate a lot. And a sort of byproduct of my teenage years, I think a lot of people go through this in some shape or form, was I began to question everything. And when I was real young, I kind of just naively and a little bit, I don't know the right word, like boasting almost, like I thought I was smarter than my family for being like, oh yeah, God's not real, and little did I know how much that was setting me back as a person. And it took me a couple years to kind of retrace those steps and be like, oh wait, hold on, if this happened in my life and this happened in my life and then this happened, maybe there is something to this God thing. And after that, once I became more and more confident in that, I realized like, wow, it wasn't Catholicism necessarily or the Bible necessarily. It was the application of these things in society that maybe turned me in the other direction. I would focus more on the political things and maybe the political reasons why the Catholic Church specifically isn't maybe a good place to find God, right? So, and I've had people on the show who have spent time in the church and walked away from it in many different denominations, but I also value the people like yourself who have taken the time to closely examine something that most people who seem to be the most adamant take the least amount of time. And I don't want to insult any of our Christian audience who does go to church every week, but I remember feeling a sort of absence of wisdom in a lot of the people who spent the most time in these places, because the whole system of running a church and taking on the business of a church became more important than like maybe the actual teachings of the Bible. So, and correct me if I'm wrong, but originally, the idea of a church wasn't even a building. It was just a group of people who had a Bible and read together. That was kind of the definition of a church to some denominations. So I really respect what you do on your podcast in that sense, and that's partly why I was like, yeah, let's do this. I haven't read the Bible as much as I probably should, so maybe you can school me on some of this and also help me understand why people keep calling me a Nephilim. I was almost certain that the Nephilim were like, disincarnated beings that, maybe more like jinn, exist in a sort of possessive way where they can, possess you if you're, weak enough to allow something like that to take you over, or maybe, you're in a certain state of crisis. But me personally, I can't say I've ever felt like I've been possessed. So I don't consider myself a Nephilim, other than the similarity.
That's the demons.
in height.
According to the book of Enoch, it says that the disembodied spirits of the Nephilim became demons.
Right. Well,
yeah.
Let's backtrack a little bit, because I do want to understand your story and give you a chance to really like give people a good idea of who you are. Like, was this something that's just sort of a part of your life? Have you always been, in this sort of Christian environment where it was, something that people were encouraging you to do? Or is this something that you recently, decided to take on? Like what led to this podcast and specifically focusing on the Bible as like the kind of the main, because it's called the Prometheus lens, right? It's not called like Ezekiel's lens or something like that, right? And then, so I'm curious, like, what's your approach with this, and also like what's your background?
Well, see, with the Prometheus lens, it's not a ministry per se, like my other podcast is, but it is, it's all these information and all these, different subjects, filtered through a biblical lens. But I like how you said earlier, because it's the truth that a lot of the people that go to church every single Sunday are the most ill-educated. And it's because of their blind faith in the pastors and in the system. And it talks about in the Bible, it says that my people perish for lack of knowledge. And it talks about when you first come into the faith, like an infant, you're fed milk. But you can't stay on milk forever. You have to eventually grow teeth and start eating meat. And that's the deeper things of the Bible. And I grew up in East Tennessee, which is, they call it the Bible Belt. And I jokingly say there's two types of pews or bars or stools rather in Tennessee. And it's either a church pew or stool or a bar stool.
Right.
It's usually the two paths you got. And I grew up in church since I was a little boy. Went to church every Sunday, did the whole Sunday school thing. And even from a young age, I was very just fascinated with the Bible. I was just a very inquisitive kid, had lots of questions, and I was very mature for my age as far as intellectually asking these questions and digging into the Bible. I was just fascinated by it. And there was some church fallout. There's usually, a lot of people, if you talk to them, they go to church or went to church, that there's usually some kind of drama or fallout because, like you said, it's a failing of the application, because we're all humans. We fall short every single day, and we have tempers and we have egos and attitudes, and those collide. But that happened in my preteen years. And then when I got to be a full teenager, especially around the age of 16, I just went into just full rebellion and got into drugs really bad. I started off just, smoking some cigarettes, and then I ended up going to pot and sampling pills, tampering around with amphetamines. And next thing you know, me and my buddies, we were eating mushrooms and acid and taking these spirit journeys, and all this stuff. And it sounds very cliche, but it was sex, drugs, and rock and roll. And through all those twists and turns and just seeing people around me just fall out and die in car wrecks and drug overdoses and going to prison, I straightened my life up in my early 20s and got clean and everything. And then I started reading my Bible again and going back to church. And once I actually started reading the Bible for myself and going through, I just found so much more stuff there that I had never heard. And it's like I grew up in church for, for many, many, many years. And then I discovered Michael Heiser's Unseen Realm. And he's talking about these Nephilim giants. in Genesis 6. And he's talking about these fallen angels coming down and breeding with the daughters of men and making these hybrid beings. And that was the reason for the flood. And then that the book of Enoch taught that they came down and gave all this knowledge to humanity. And at this point, I had seen the shows Ancient Aliens and stuff like that. And I'm like, that's exactly what they're talking about. And the Tower of Babel, that was another Sunday school lesson that just, they decided to build this tower up into heaven and God divided the languages. Well, no, when you get into Deuteronomy, it says that not only were the tongues divided, it says the peoples were divided amongst the sons of God, the B'nai Ha Elohim. And so there you have this whole divine council, like the Greek gods set up, where these different angelic beings are rulers and overseers of nations. And so then that explains, when you have a lot of aggressive non-believers that will say, well, your God is, if he is real, then he is an evil God. He kills all of civilization. He orders mass genocide of all peoples in your book of Exodus. Well, both of those are answered because of the Nephilim giants. They were not humans. He was trying to erase a hybrid race. If he didn't intervene, then the human population would have been completely wiped out. And all the evil in this world, the rapings, the killings, and all this stuff. So, if your God's real and he allows all this stuff, well, then he's evil. Well, they don't know about the Deuteronomy 32 worldview with all these fallen angels ruling over the nations. But there was just all these, things in there that are plainly there, but not taught in church. And I had to read and find them out for myself. And once I started, I couldn't stop. So I just had to tell some friends about it. And that's, like I said, it grew from there to a podcast. And then once I started looking into the histories and stuff, all this stuff filtered right through again, because the Greek pantheons, right. That's the divine council, all the ancient alien stuff. That's the Genesis 6 fallen angels narrative. Then you have the UFO stuff going on. You hear of abductions. I have a good friend, Karen Wilkinson, said she was abducted since she was a little girl. And she became pregnant several times, confirmed at the doctor's office, went for a checkup, the baby is gone. Well, how do you explain that? Well, it's Genesis 6 all over again. It's the same thing. It's just repackaged and changed over time.
Right.
They're creating Nephilim hybrids, these fallen sons of God. So it was just very interesting to me to just look into these subjects and see how they stack up. And the more I look in, the more I'm confirmed in the biblical narrative. It's just a fascinating journey, not only for me, but for the people that listen and follow along as well.
Yeah. Well, Michael Heiser is a great place to start for people who want to read more about this. Obviously, your book as well, The Epic of Esau. But one book that stands out as I'm kind of looking at his bibliography here, his selected works, is Supernatural, What the Bible Teaches Us About the Unseen World and Why It Matters. This seems to be one of his more popular books, but I think this is, again, to add to your point and your critique towards those defiant non-believers who are very adamant about these, what they call like absurdities in the Bible, yet it seems like they're really only getting like index card versions of the Bible. Like, they're not really taking the time to study it. It's a very dismissive and, really short-sighted approach to criticizing something. So when you can go deeper beyond that and realize that maybe all this fuss about atheism is being artificially put out into the culture. Over time, we see our culture changing so much with the Industrial Revolution and the Enlightenment, where all these occult ideas and these ways of interacting with these invisible realms start to become more and more readily available to people. And I don't see our society improving in all the ways that you would expect if these spiritual beings had our best interests in mind and were going to come here and be partners with us. Maybe, okay, free will is stopping them, and they can only do so much. They can only just kind of give us clues and hints, and we have to do all the work, right? But I think there's something missing to all of that. And I wonder, maybe you're touching on a more exact explanation of what's really going on in the world. And that's why there is such a suppression of this more traditional faith, what people kind of write off as faith. It doesn't really feel like faith when I talk to someone like yourself. It sounds like confidence. It sounds like knowing. It sounds a lot more like, surety, which that's something that we all can benefit from, having a sense of knowing in this world. I think that, again, going back to our other point, a lot of people are just, stumbling through life from bar stool to bar stool, not really knowing what they're here for.
Yeah, and that was what I was saying that was just so profound for me, was because most Christians, and I know I'm painting with a very broad brush here, but most Christians, they grow up in church and they're told about, just the Great Flood. They're told about the Tower of Babel, Jesus on the cross, and these things, and they're told from a very young age repeatedly. And it becomes to the point where, you believe it, you have faith in it, but that's where it just stops. It's just like me, I said before in several podcasts that this sounds awful, but I'm being honest and genuine, is it got to the point where it was just kind of mundane. It was ceremonial. I was just going to church. I'd sit in the pew. I would hear the same 4 or 5 cookie cutter messages repeated over and over again. And it was just like, yes, I know Jesus went to the cross and died for me. Yes, I know there was a great flood. And yes, I know at the Tower of Babel, the tongues and nations were divided, because I had faith in it and I'd been told that my whole life. But like you said, but when you know that you know that you know, it just emboldens you. It draws you closer to the Creator, and it solidifies. It's no longer just faith. It's foundation stones for your faith to stand on, because then it changes. It's no longer, I know there was a great flood. No, I know there's a great flood from the Bible, but I also know there was a great flood because we're finding seashells on Mount Everest. I know the Bible to be true because it says the boat landed on Mount Ararat, and that Noah, the first thing he did was planted a vineyard. Scientifically proven. Vineyards near the base of Mount Ararat have been scientifically tested and proven to be the oldest vineyards in the world. Jesus, I know from the Bible that, he died on the cross for my sins. Well, now I know that he was the most historically covered man in the world. We have a shroud of Turin that marks all the markings of the crucifixion and matches the Bible to a T. They found Sodom and Gomorrah with sulfur balls inside of it. They found Jericho with the walls caved out. All of these things, it's just the Bible keeps being reaffirmed and proved when people search it out and look it out. So it's just like, it's no longer just blind faith. It's a surety. And it just, there's no way I can put words to it. It just solidifies your faith and draws you closer to the Creator. And it's no longer just some ethereal thing that you believe. No, it's something that you can feel, taste, and touch and know. And once that happens, it emboldens you. And makes you want to grab your shovel and go dig and find these gold nuggets. It's a treasure hunt.
Well, and I imagine, not only can you benefit from that sense of independence and freedom and even like reverence and kind of like a partnership with the rest of, because we kind of live in this, when you grow up thinking the way the mainstream kind of puts you to, you kind of think to, oh well, all my thoughts are mine and no one else knows what's going on, like no one else knows me, right? It's very like isolating and alone, right? Whereas this kind of reminds you like, hey, no, we're all in this together, and there's somebody looking out for you if you can lean in that direction, right? I think so many of us want to be helped, but we have trouble taking that step towards helping ourselves, and that seems to be the message I've received. But I want to get in a little bit more of the, maybe we'll say specifics, but not necessarily, maybe more of the tantalizing stuff. So with the Bible, with really the Abrahamic religions in general, a lot of focus is put on, this end times, right? And the world we're in ending, right? And I think that's been really obscured for political reasons. It's something you can hold over people's heads and manipulate them with by saying, the end's coming, you're going to be judged, do what I tell you or else, right? And maybe there's truth in that, and it is being, exploited by bad people, sure, but it still could be true despite those bad people exploiting it. But I'm curious, like, help us understand the world we're in now and how it got the way it is, because when you realize that we're not in a perfect world, the end of the world doesn't seem so bad. If it means we're getting into maybe a better world, we're going to go somewhere better than this, or the earth maybe will become something completely unrecognizable from what we're used to here in this sort of like lower vibration sphere where these principalities are ruling over us in this kind of demonic energy zapping kind of way, right? We're given this image right in the beginning of the Bible of this abundant Garden of Eden. And, it's not just Adam and Eve there. There's all sorts of, things going on. And this speaking serpent comes along and nobody's like, oh, no, the snake's talking. They just accept it, right? So, like, help us understand maybe that, like, because clearly they weren't living in the same world we are in this Garden of Eden. It wasn't just like, they were living in a forest in a field and that was the Garden of Eden. No, the earth was a completely different place at that time, correct?
Oh, yeah. And the thing, too, is like any good investigator or cop, if a crime happens and you have two people standing at the scene when you roll up and you're told by another officer or whoever, you're told by somebody, hey, these two guys hung around to talk to you. The one on the left was here and eyewitnessed and seen it. The other guy, his buddy's buddy was here and was an eyewitness, and he told his buddy, and then his buddy told his buddy, and then that buddy told him. You're going to want to talk to the one on the left, the one that was eyewitness, because he seen it and has the clearest memory of it. And we need to be that way with the Bible. It's no different. So we have to remember that this book is, thousands of years old. It was written to a people and a culture that was much different than ours. And this is something that Michael Heiser does so very well. And he's got his doctorate degree in ancient languages, in Hebrew and Greek, and even ancient dead languages. He's made his life work doing this type of thing. But the unseen realm is his crowning achievement. And you mentioned supernatural. That is the more layman version of that book. They're both the same book. It's just supernatural was kind of de-scholared, and kind of put in layman's terms, so more the general population could
less
take
academic.
it in. And so, but he said in that book, and it was right at the beginning about this subject, he said, so you need to get back to the source. He said, if you asked any ancient Israelite, why is the world in the shape that it's in right now? He said, their answer would be very different from a Christian that you would ask today. He said, a Christian today would say, oh, Adam and Eve, they screwed the pooch in the garden. If Eve wouldn't have bit that apple, everything would be perfect. He said, but the ancient Israelite would say the 3 rebellions. There wasn't just one, there was 3. So the first one was the Garden of Eden, the one that everybody's so familiar with. But he broke that down, and he said that the word used for serpent was nakash. And he said that the Jewish language is no different than the English language. The English language is so very hard to learn. If you talk to any, Spanish person or any foreigner that's trying to assimilate into the American culture and learn the language, they all tell you without fail that it's so hard, that you have so many words that sound identical, but they're completely different. And so, and also that multiple words can have multiple meanings. So the context and how it's used is what's very important. And he said, so the Hebrew language is no different. So Nakash can mean serpent, but it can also mean the shining one, or the one who practices divination. He said, so if you look at the context of that story, he said, what makes more sense? He said, a talking serpent deceives Adam and Eve. He said, or a shining one who practices divination. He said, because Eden was a garden on God's holy mountain where his divine assembly reigned. And it talks about it in the book of Job when Job's questioning God, and God finally has enough of it and confronts him, and he's saying, where were you when I done this? Where were you when I done that, when I laid the foundations? And he said, and he was talking about creation, he said, and where were you when the morning stars, the sons of God, sang for joy at the sight of creation? And that's that same word, B'nai Ha Elohim, sons of God, that was used in Genesis 6, and that was also used in the Deuteronomy 32 Tower of Babel event. So every time that word is used, it's referring to angelic heavenly beings every time. So he said, so there you had the sons of God at the site of creation because they were there first. They're basically our elder brothers. So he said, a talking snake does not make sense. He said, but if it was a member of God's divine council, that makes a lot more sense. He said, because number one, snakes don't talk. He said, look at the reaction of Eve. If a snake would have rolled up and started talking to her, she would have been freaked out or scared. She was neither one of those things. But when this Nakash spoke to her, she listened to it. She wasn't afraid, and she trusted it. So he said in the book, so that points to me that this was not a snake. This was a divine being on the heavenly council. Number two, that she was familiar with it. She's seen it every day in the garden. And then number three, that she trusted it. Because when he says to her, did God really say that you shall die? No, you shall be as gods. She never questioned him. She just took it and ate it. So So that was your first rebellion. And then your second one, it's the same thing. You have these B'nai Ha Elohim. It says that the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were fair and came down and chose for them wives and created the Nephilim giants, the mighty men of old. And here's where you get all your stories of Hercules and Perseus and all these. It's Maui. Throughout culture, throughout time, it's universal. And so that's where these guys come from. And then it says to Book of Enoch that they traded forbidden knowledge to the people and corrupted them. And so that's why in Genesis it says that they were so corrupt that every thought was continuously evil. In these Hebrew languages, this is why it's so important. You miss this stuff. When it talks about Noah, when this happens, he goes and warns Noah and tells him to build a boat. Well, it says that Noah was the only righteous man left. Well, that word, righteous, is tamim. He was tamim. Tamim, once again, it can mean righteous. But when you look at the context of how that word was used throughout Scripture, in the Old Testament, that word was used to describe the purity of the blood of the sacrificial animals. So it wasn't saying that Noah was a perfect man, because as soon as the boat lands, he plants a vineyard and starts drinking until he passes out naked. If he was a perfect man, then that wouldn't have happened. But no, it was saying that his bloodline was pure, that these Nephilim giants had interbred and contaminated the human DNA pool so much that he was the only one left. So if God didn't bring the flood and wipe out these Nephilim and kill these bloodlines, and taking with it the forbidden knowledge that corrupted all humanity, then we wouldn't be here today. The bloodline would have been completely wiped out. And so then that was the second one. And then the third rebellion, once again, we have these B'nai Ha Elohim. That's the common theme in these three rebellions. And this was the Tower of Babel. And I discussed that earlier. It says that not only the tongues were divided, the nations were divided amongst the sons of God. So even after the flood, we started worshiping these false gods again, but this was a different set, because the fallen angels they were put in Tartarus. So once again, we have all signs point to another rebellion. So they started worshiping these angelic beings as gods. So God finally got fed up, and he's like, okay, you want to chase after these other gods and let them rule over you? I'm going to give you what you want, because it's not what you think it is. So he tells his sons that was rebelling against him, I'm going to give you this portion, and I'm going to give you this portion. I'm dividing up the lands. And it says in there that he give it to them as an inheritance. But he said, Israel, Jacob, is my allotted portion. So he's saying, I give everybody this portion, but this one's mine. Because the grand plan was that through Abraham, through his lineage, the true perfect man, the second Adam, Jesus Christ, was going to come. So he protected that bloodline so that the Christ came, and he was the perfect sacrifice, ending all that stuff. And just the overall story of the Bible is about family. We were once in the house of the Creator, living in perfect harmony. Our Father took care of our every need. But through deception and rebellion in the family, which is a common thing, the elder brother became jealous of us, the younger brother, and turned against us. So it's all about family coming back together and returning to the perfection of the Garden of Eden. It's actually just a beautiful story when you sit back and you think about it. And these parables and stories we hear in the Bible, they're so multi-layered, and a lot of us just miss because if you took one parable to describe the overall theme of the Bible, that would be the parable of the good tenant. In that story, Jesus is telling the people, he says, there was a man that owned a vineyard, and he lent it or rented it out to a set of farmers. And they didn't have the money to pay, so they made an agreement that the first fruits of the harvest would go to the landowner. And they worked the ground. He let them be the lords over it. And then after the first crop came in, he sent a messenger to collect the first fruits like they agreed. And the farmers beat up the messenger and sent him away. So then he sends another messenger. Same thing, but they kill this one. And this goes on several times until finally he says, I will send my son. They will not harm my son. So when the son shows up, the farmers say, hey, we're going to kill the son. We're going to send a message, and he's going to leave us alone. He's not going to come back. And that son was Jesus Christ. That land that he lent out was earth, the dominion of earth. And he was describing Deuteronomy 32, the Tower of Babel. And the same thing with the prodigal son. What did you have in that story? You have an elder son that stayed with the father, never left. Then you have a younger son that rebels, wants his inheritance now, squanders it all away, comes back home thinking that he's going to be rejected, but he's welcomed with loving arms and welcomed back into the family and given his ring of authority back. But the brother, the elder brother, is pissed off. He confronts his dad. He's like, you allow him back in. He squandered our inheritance. He made our family name. He tarnished it. He made us look like fools. And you throw this big banquet for him. You know, how's this supposed to make me feel? I'm the elder son. I've never messed up. I've been wise and been by your side, never left. You've never threw me this kind of banquet. All those stories, they do have superficial meanings, but they also have deeper ones too that tell the overall story, our story.
Yeah, this is really hitting home for me, brother. I love it. I'm glad we're having this conversation. Yeah, man. And yes, it's something that I had to take some notes on, and please, maybe I missed this, but was the Tower of Babel connected in the third rebellion? Because you mentioned like the gods, the demigods, not God, but these, false gods had kind of divided up the humans into like, all right, you guys are going to worship me over here. You guys are going to worship me over here. So is this an explanation for how we have all these different cultures with different languages and all kind of similar ideas and concepts, but very different? I mean, this is how this was explained in a way.
Yeah, because I don't know, like when I went to school, they had this thing they called it a telephone game. So the teacher would tell a story or a sentence to a student and whisper it in his ear. Then that student had to turn around and whisper the story to the next kid, and it went around the whole room. And by the time you got through, just 15, 20 people, the last one had to stand up and repeat the sentence. And the teacher would have the actual sentence written on a piece of paper and to show. And by the time it just went through 15, 20 people, that story was so twisted and it wasn't even remotely the same. And that's what we had with the Tower of Babel. So think about it. This is a culture that before the time of writing, you relied on oral tradition and stories, the passing of knowledge that way. So here we have all the nations gathered together under one language, one tongue. And once the tongues are divided and the nations are divided, everybody spreads out. Well, everybody still got those same stories, and they start telling them. Well, they're telling it in their own language, and then after it passes through, just the allusion to the classroom, just 15, 20 kids, it got twisted so out of proportion. It was nothing near the original. So imagine going through thousands of years, how all the different nations took those original stories and how the names changed, just all these different twists and turns to the story. That's how that happened. But at the same time, when you look at comparative mythology, why do we have, pyramids on every single continent? Why do we see serpent imagery throughout the world, throughout different times and cultures? Why do we always have a dying and resurrecting God in all these different mythos? Why do we always have a rebellion, whether it's Prometheus in the Greeks that steals the fire, which was symbolic for the wisdom, and gives it to mankind? You have the Genesis 6 narrative, the fallen angels came down and gave the forbidden knowledge to humanity. When you go to Polynesia, it's Maui. Maui goes into the underworld and steals the fire for mankind. The Apkallu sages in Mesopotamia going around and civilizing the world. Osiris in Egypt taught them how to grow crops and do math and to map the stars. And it even says in the Egyptian Edfu building texts that Osiris loaded up his ship every year and just set sail to civilize the world. In South America, you have Viracocha. Says that he came out of the Lake Titicaca and taught the people how to do math and agriculture, math, architecture, all these things. Then you go up a little further north into Mexico. You have the same exact carbon copy story, but it's Quetzalcoatl. Then you go a little further north into North America. You have all the different various Native American tribes. Without fail, every single one of them talk about the star people. The star people came down and took our women, made Nephilim giants, that they taught us all of our sciences and taught us how to grow corn. I mean, it's without fail, and that's just one example of the passing of the knowledge. You have every single culture has a great flood account. It just all these things. Well, they sound so familiar because they all stemmed from an ancient source, and that was before the Tower of Babel.
Yeah, and I don't know if you've interviewed this gentleman yet, and I do think you should. I encourage you. His name is Paul Stobbs, and one of the things that you reminded me of that he talks about is how around the world you have these traditional cultures that have some semblance of what they worship maybe in the time when the Bible was originally written, right? These groups of people who would have been maybe worshiping these gods, and time after time they refer to this type of reverence as ancestor reverence. These are our ancestors. We came from these people, right? And I think there's a sort of trickery going on here where we're being duped into this position of subservience, whereas what it seems like is being offered by God the Father, our real God, is this actual independence, a sort of sovereignty amongst God, rather than this kind of like dependency. Oh, we need the ancestors. We would be nothing without them. It's more of like you're not God yourself, but you're human, and love yourself and be yourself, and do what it means to be a human. I don't know, maybe I'm using like very simplistic terms here because I'm trying to like include both audiences, because I'm sure some people who are maybe more like me a couple years ago, they would see maybe the title of this episode and be like, oh, they're talking about the Bible again, right? And I do want to include everybody and kind of, I don't know, I feel like Gnosticism has some aspects that reflect what you're telling me. And I know, like, if I knew like Gnosticism more accurately, it might be kind of run a little bit of astray from what true Christianity actually means. But there is an aspect of it, and I'm curious, like, what do you think about those parts of the Bible that were left out, and have you examined those? Because these are the realms that typically people go to and say things like, well, here, look, these are aliens that are being described, flying shields and wheels flying in the sky, right? And I'm not sure, maybe correct me if I'm wrong, if those things are mentioned in the parts of the Bible that haven't been left out, but there were parts of the Bible that were taken and removed, and we only found out about them, a couple, maybe like 8 or 9 decades ago, right? So how do you reconcile that, and does that add to any of this? Because it does seem like we're kind of we're trying to nail down an accurate understanding of where we are, who we are, and what we are, right? Everybody wants to know those.
Any intelligent mind, that's the first questions you ask.
Right.
I mean, if you come up in a fishbowl, your first question should be, is this a fishbowl? Am I a fish, and how did I get here?
Right.
But as far as like Gnosticism, I've looked into it. I have not just done super deep dives, but I have done studies on it and done a few podcasts on it with the Dig Bible podcast. But once again, you have the telephone game. You have an ancient source and that things stem from, and then as they go out, they get twisted and manipulated. And this is what Gnosticism was. It stemmed from Christianity. But what happened was these Gnostics were doing a lot of pagan things in the privacy of their home. Like, for instance, a lot of the pagan occult systems, like the Mithras cult, the Dionysus cult, a lot of these cults have their kukions and their sacred drinks and rituals, and they were hallucinogens. And they would take these and have these revelations. They'd be visited by this spirit being, angel, UFO, whatever, the case may be, and were told, new information. And they wrote it down, and where they were having these real experiences. They thought that they were really gods. And they were telling them, and like the inside joke is, Christians will say the greatest trick the devil ever played was telling everyone he didn't exist. Well, when you talk to a Gnostic, they take it a step further. They say the greatest trick the devil ever pulled was tricking you into worshiping him as God. Because they believe, and this was through the rituals and taking of these hallucinogens, that these gods and God appeared to them in these demiurges and archons and revealed these things to them. That in the beginning was Sophia, and that's Greek for knowledge, wisdom. And that Sophia was basically, and I'm paraphrasing here, and I'm not an expert, but that she was lonely, so she split herself and made this dualism of herself, a male and female version. And this male they called the demiurge. And so then you have the matriarchy and the patriarchy. So you have the monarchy, I'm sorry. So you have the male ruling aspect and then the female. Of course, the female is nurturing and loving and soft. And then the male is like the father. He is domineering He is strict and all about dealing punishment and making people walk the line. And this demiurge, since he is the male aspect, the males are the ones that build and create. So he creates earth and then creates humanity and rules them with an iron fist. And that this, to them, is Satan. And he tricks everyone into believing that he is the true God. Everyone should worship him. And during all this process, she ends up splitting herself, I believe it's 10 different times. And so it's like 10 aspects of Sophia. And they call each aspect an archon. And an archon is basically what we would call an angel, or a heavenly being, with supernatural powers. And these archons are basically like wardens or overseers. And that earth becomes a prison. And that Sophia, in her love for humanity, wants to set them free from the demiurge and this prison that the demiurge has created. So she inserts herself into the program. She puts her spirit into the program, and it's what they call the Christ consciousness. And their theology is that Jesus Christ was not the Son of God. That Jesus Christ basically become one with the universe. And at his baptism, when the clouds opened up and said, "Here's my son in whom I'm well pleased," that was basically when he received the Sophia consciousness and was quote unquote adopted. And that the cross didn't happen. That it was metaphor. That his ego basically was put to death. And he rise like the ashes of a great phoenix into this new creation where he activated the divine spark that was within him, and that this spirit is accessible to all of us, that every single one of us is a shard or a piece off of Sophia. That we've been tricked by the demiurge, that we're not special and we're just slaves to the system. So through Gnosticism, which is, through wisdom, we acquire this Christ consciousness and become gods ourselves. So when you look at it through the biblical lens, it's the original lie that Satan says in the garden. He says, "No, eat this and ye shall be as gods." So you had these Gnostics that were inserting themselves into the church and like secretly pulling people out of the church. And like you said, in the beginning they had home churches. It's just people got together in their house and studied the word. And that's what they done. But they were drinking these psychedelic drinks and teaching people, something close to what I was describing there. And that's an ancient pagan practice that's been going on since the beginning. And I'm of the opinion that they are accessing spirits and having real life encounters. But these are the fallen angels and these members of this divine council that rebelled against God is what they're having encounters with. So the church shunned them, kicked them out of the churches because they knew that they were just infiltrating the churches and spreading this false doctrine and leading people astray. And where people were sitting in the church and hearing about miracles and hearing about seeing miraculous things, wasn't experiencing it. So then here these Gnostics roll up and say, well, they talk about it here, but we actually do it over here. And where these people were engaging in this and drinking these psychedelic drinks, they were seeing spirits. They were, seeing themselves leave their bodies and go into the second heaven, like the John the Revelator and some of these other guys reported seeing in the Bible. So they, in my opinion, that they were deceived. And it's just the same thing that you see, just like Solomon says. He says, nothing new is under the sun. We will see this thing and marvel and say, this is a new thing. But no, it is an old thing being rediscovered now. Yeah. So a lot of these Gnostic books that you find is just their writings. And where the church knew what they were doing, what they were up to, they didn't make it into the Bible, because Constantine, you got to think that Rome was conquering the world. And Constantine had just converted to Christianity. And at that time, the Bible was in existence, but it wasn't a Bible. It wasn't all together. It was just all kinds of scrolls. And the Jewish people had the Torah, but that was the only book that you had. But you had at this time Revelation from John, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, all those scrolls and different writings all floating around. And then here started popping up these scrolls that they found in Nag Hammadi with these different teachings. So where Constantine had control over all of these different countries and city-states, just converted to Christianity, they didn't have a book. The Jewish people had a book, but the Jewish people weren't Christians. They didn't believe that Christ was the Son of God. So they put together the Council of Nicaea in 325, and they laid out all of these scrolls, and they talked about them, read them, debated, and then voted and compiled what we have today, which is our 66 book, quote unquote canon. And the ones that didn't make the cut were either what they believed to be just heresy, which was these Gnostic texts that were floating around. If they couldn't determine definitively who the author was, it was threw out. And the whole purpose was to unify Christians in their theology to one book. And the main reason, in my opinion, is because of the Gnostics. Because there was such mass confusion. There was no set standard made. So what was important to them was the story of Christ, the foundation of Christ. So they wanted to make sure that they had the Torah, which was basically the history book showing where Christianity started from, and then the coming of Messiah, and trying to do their best to set a standard and put some books together that conveyed the gospel of Christ, so the Christians, especially the new ones, weren't deceived and pulled out of the faith through these Gnostic teachings.
Really glad I asked that, because this is something that, again, like I said, it was uncannily similar, and I'm like, there's got to be something to this. I felt a little dumb for asking, but now I don't feel so dumb. I'm glad I got that explanation, because it's stuff I'm familiar with Gnosticism, but I'm glad to hear your perspective on it, because it's easy to come across things on the internet that'll tell you a lot of things about Christ that would suggest he's like a magician, a shaman. Yeah. And I wonder how true that is to your research into the Bible And maybe this represents these Nephilim, these fallen angels, these, interfering, manipulating what is supposed to be a way out of their entrapment.
Out of the system.
Exactly.
And see, that's what they want to do, because from my perspective, nothing has changed. It's just the characters have changed their name. And even Satan portrays himself as an angel of light. And he does give you truth. But if you don't know the word well, he can twist just a few little words around and completely send you in the wrong direction. And that's what he's done. And these fallen angels and Satan, the ones that are ruling over the nations even today, they want to keep you enslaved to them and in the system. And remember, like I said in the book of Job, the sons of God were there at the site of creation. And it says that all things were made for, through, and by Jesus Christ. That he was the plan from the beginning, since the foundation stones were laid. They knew the plan. They were there. They didn't know how it was going to come, but they knew it was coming. So they're going to do everything in their power to try to set the chessboard up for the checkmate while the masters went to the bathroom or turned his head. They're going to do everything they can to try and stack the deck and deceive. So, and a lot of these Gnostics will point to this Christ consciousness because of what they call the corn kings. And by that they mean the dying and resurrecting gods. So they'll point to Mithras, which does. He predates Christ. And Mithras was a dying and resurrecting god. He had disciples. They performed many miracles. He had a Last Supper. He promised them that he would die and resurrect, and that in the end he would return and judge the wicked and take the followers to heaven. And they use that, and they're like, oh, well, case closed. Here you go. Jesus Christ is a carbon copy of Mithras, and this proves our Christ consciousness. Mithras was another Christ conscience. He was where the spirit of Sophia inhabited him. And Jesus is another example. Buddha is another. He performed miracles and done all these great things because he had the Christ consciousness. And you can go through and name, all these different gods that were uncannily similar to Jesus Christ. And I'll say this, and I've tried my best to do this, it's my opinion that these guys knew the story. They knew what was going to happen. So they tried to get ahead of the game. They done these things and imitated the coming Messiah to try to deceive future generations. And it says in the Bible that what the devil plans for harm, God twists and changes for the good of those who love him. So I try to look at it this way. God allowed them to do that because in the end, it was going to bite them in the rear end. Because think about it, Paul says that if they would have known killing Christ on the cross would have sealed their fate, they never would have crucified the Lord of glory. They knew he was coming. They kind of knew the plan. They didn't know all the details. But but they shot themselves in the foot, and he allowed them to do so. And I think this is another example of that, because if Christ was coming to end the rule of all these archons ruling over the nations and free the people, but it has to be their decision. He says, my kingdom is not of this world. So basically you have to revoke your citizenship from their country and their rule and apply to his kingdom and his rule. Well, what's going to increase the probability of someone to do that except a familiar story? So after Jesus resurrects, he tells his disciples, go into the ends of the earth and make disciples of all the nations. So here they go. They go out into these other countries and start telling this story. And if they, in that region, have a similar story, they're going to be like, oh, yeah, I know all about this. Yeah, this, this, and this. Yeah, we'll accept this God, because it sounds familiar to them. They're more prone to accept it. And I always say it, I see it as a preconditioning that these fallen angels and Satan tried to use to deceive the nations and get them to reject. But in fact, once again, history repeats itself. They shot themselves in the foot, and this was a preconditioning, and the people were more prone to accept it. And I think we see this reappropriation in the Bible constantly. And it's kind of like God smearing the face of the enemy. I think we see that when you look at the book of Jonah. Well, those that are not familiar with that, God tells Jonah to go to Nineveh and to preach the gospel, tell them to repent, or he was going to destroy them. Well, Nineveh is modern-day Iraq. And the Jewish people and the Iraqi people, they hated each other. So Jonah didn't want to go. He couldn't stand those people. He didn't want to save those people. He wanted to see them destroyed. So he tries to go the other way. He gets on a boat and tries to sail far, far away. Well, God ends up sinking the ship, and he's swallowed up by a great fish. And that being in the belly of this fish for 3 days is spit up onto the beach of Nineveh. Well, here's all the people of the town sees this man or this fish roll up onto the beach and spit this man out. And then this man goes into town, hey, you guys are all going to perish. You better stop sacrificing your children to Molech and worshiping these false gods, or Yahweh, the Lord of heaven, is going to rain down fire on you, and it's not going to be pretty. And I think he kind of just half-heartedly did it. It doesn't say that, but I'm just kind of putting myself in his position. It's like he didn't want to go there anyway. He hates these people. His boat was capsized, swallowed by a fish for 3 days, and vomited on a beach. Okay, I'll do it. You guys better repent, and Yahweh's going to destroy you. Well, they do. They do the exact opposite of what Jonah wanted and what he thought they would do. They all repented of their ways and started worshiping Yahweh, so that the city was spared. Well, when you do some deep diving, the city of Nineveh worshiped this god called Dagon. Dagon was a fish god. He was half fish, half man. And when you look at the depictions, some of them show him looking like a merman, but then there's also depictions that shows this fish curved upward with its mouth open, and then a man from torso up hanging out of the fish of the mouth. You don't tell me, you're not going to tell me that God didn't use some preconditioning there so the people would listen. The people seen Jonah get threw up out of a great fish's mouth. They thought it was Dagon himself. he allowed these false gods, these fallen angels, to parade around as this fish god for ever how many thousands of years, and then used it to his benefit to allow the people to be saved of Nineveh. And when you look at the creation story, it talks about, him subduing chaos. His spirit hovered over the waters. That word is the tahom. That is a cognate of the word Tiamat. And if you look into the Babylonian creation epic, their creation epic is that there was this chaos dragon named Tiamat. And that Marduk comes down and defeats this chaos dragon and uses her pieces to form and make earth. So there, once again, he was taking these fallen angelic beings' stories and mythos and using it to his glory and benefit. So therefore, when these Babylonian pagans read the Genesis account, you don't think they were like, oh man, I believe that. I already believe that. That's Marduk, and Paul done the same thing when he went to Greece. He goes to Mars Hill, and it says that there's hundreds of these god statues all over the place. And they were smart, intellectual people and worshiped these pantheons of gods. But there was one statue that didn't have a name. But the plate said, "This is to the unknown God." So what does Paul do? He goes up and he starts talking to him. He's like, hey, you Greeks, we know that you're a smart people. You've invented this and that, and you're high society, and I know you're intelligent. And you worship all these other gods, and yes, there are other gods. You are right, and there are many. And he was referring to these fallen angelic beings. He said, but you have this statue over here that is to the unnamed God. I know who that unnamed God is. And he is the supreme creator God that created all these other ones. And his name is Yahweh. Through the preconditioning that God allowed, he used to his good to convert the hearts and minds of the Greeks. I think we see this type of preconditioning over and over and over again of these fallen angelic beings, which the Bible calls gods. The people call them gods, and uses their trickery and their own stories against them to win the hearts and minds of God's people.
Wow, that's incredible. And I love where you started with that, because it makes so much sense from where we just were to now. And I really got to give it up to you, brother. I'm impressed. You talk the talk and you walk the walk, and it's impressive. And this is why I like having these conversations, because I can ask you a question and you give me not only one good example, but 2, 3, 4. And what's interesting about the Jonah thing, aside from the fact that, most people, like myself included, only really know, oh yeah, Jonah got eaten by a whale. I had no clue the context behind why he was swallowed up by a fish, right? And now you start to understand, it's almost kind of like God has a sense of humor with this, sort of irony there too in this story of yeah, all right, you guys want to, worship these fake, gods. Here's a fake prophet, and joke's on you, it actually worked, right? And this guy, he's just kind of bumbling along, I don't really want to do this. And I'm sure there's an aspect to that where he gets, I don't know the Bible as well as you do, clearly. So does Jonah sort of realize from that, oh wow, I did do a good thing there? Or does he just move on with his life and we don't know what happens to him after the people of Nineveh repent?
Oh, well, he's pissed off. He does.
really
He wanted to see
hates-
him destroyed. He
Wow.
goes outside of the city and says that he sits under a tree, and he's just like upset. Like, God, why'd you save these people? You should have let them burn.
Right. Wow. Well, and there's the futility of him where, he was a vessel for God's message, whether he wanted it that way or not. And I think there's a real beautiful irony in that. And wow. So with that, I think there's a sort of like a concept here that's at least emerging for me a lot more clearly, which is like these avatars, maybe is a general way to describe them, that you see around the world kind of coming into these cultures and, mimicking Christ. These very well could have been possibly, what do you think, Nephilim or fallen angels that were maybe like, all right, well, we see the whole demigod thing's coming to an end. Let's be tricksters and pretend to be the real Messiah. That's essentially what you're saying, right? Because one thing that is turned inverted to get people to say like exactly what you were talking about before with Gnosticism is like, oh, look where Jesus is in this culture and look where Jesus is in this culture. Don't you see how it's happening in all these places? And it's very tricky how that idea can be turned one way and take you in a whole nother direction, or turned the other way and allow you to see very clearly, oh, okay, we're being duped. We're being hustled here. So, wow, okay.
I think that's exactly what it is. And I seen a YouTube clip from this guy from, I think it was the 70s. If it wasn't the 70s, it was the very early 80s, because just the clothes he had like a little afro going on. But he was on some show, and I wish I could remember what it was. But what he said was
like
so simple, and it was so profound, because he was searching out. He said, I wanted to find out what the true faith was. I wanted to figure out this God thing. He said, so I did. He said, I had no preconceived notions. I didn't grow up in church. He said, so I went through one by one. He said, I read the Quran from front to back. He said, I read the Rig Vedas. I read just, all these. He said, I went through every religion systematically. He said, and I noticed a common theme. He said, every single religion without fail acknowledges Jesus. He said, now they vary on how they acknowledge him. He said, some say that he was a prophet. He was a Buddha. He was a wise man. He had a Christ consciousness. He said, all these religions acknowledge Jesus. He said, and they acknowledged him in a very positive light. He said, so I went to Christianity last. He said, because it's the most common in my face and easy to research. He said, so after I discovered all that, he said, then I turned to the Bible. He said, and I got to reading the Bible. He said, every single religion in the world without fail pointed to Jesus. He said, so then when I got to Jesus, he said, Jesus pointed at himself. And he said, I am the way, I am the truth, and I am the life. No man comes unto the Father except through me. He said, all the other religions point to him, and he points to him. I'm going to go with the theology and beliefs of the whole world, whether they believe it or not.
Yeah, man, I love it. And again, like, I did want to take people down this path with you, and I'm glad I followed that instinct. It's something that I think connects to a lot of the other areas of the paranormal and the strange. Obviously, a lot of these things that people think are separate and in their own categories maybe have a common understanding behind them, right? That's kind of the what I'm gleaming from your perspective. And correct me if I'm wrong, but there's a disembodied sort of force, these beings that were taken out during the flood, Yet there's also, let's say, these other types of creatures who have stuck around. Maybe they didn't get totally wiped out in the flood. And we have evidence of these beings in the form of stories of giants. We have evidence of these things in, giant skeletons that have been dug up. And we also have modern day encounters with what we now think of as like a hairy ape Sasquatch creature. But by all intensive purposes, it's a giant. So, again, this like Nakash, Shining One, serpent, this multi-layered concept of a definition of a word is not a singular definition. There's, multiplicity there in the definition. So, and I think, again, like that's true with what we now think of as UFOs, what we now think of as ghosts, and maybe even like the darker side of all of that. You're friends with Tony Merkel, so I don't have to list all the different creatures. Tony spoke to all the eyewitnesses. He's got the full book on all the different weird creatures. But help us understand where Bigfoot fits into the biblical perspective, and also like where these beings that we're told about in the Bible, these shining ones, maybe are still present here today, and maybe even other groups. I mean, I don't know if the shining ones are the only ones, or if there's others beyond them. Like how loose is this definition of fallen angels? Is all of this considered fallen angels, or is there sort of a hierarchy here, I guess is kind of my question.
Yeah, well, the Bible talks about that it's the kingdom of heaven is like any, kingdom. You have a king, you have a prince, you have armies, you have messengers, and so on and so forth. And the Bible says that, Yahweh is the Lord of hosts, the Lord of armies. And the word actual Satan, is Hasatan. It's a job description. It's the accuser, is what it means. It's his job, like in a courtroom, the divine courtroom, to accuse the brethren, to tempt and accuse. He's like a prosecuting attorney. And even the word angel, that is a job descriptor. It's a blanket term that just means messenger. And then you have descriptions of these things called seraphim. They're the burning ones. You have the four-faced cherubim. And I think that's another multi-layered thing. I think that they are, entities, actual entities. But then, just like the parables, it's like onion. You have all these different layers. But it's also astronomical, because it talks about having four faces. One of a man, one of a bull, one of an eagle, and one of a man. And when you take those and apply them astronomically, that's the four cardinal points of the Babylonian zodiac. So it's like when you get into the book of Revelation, it says that you have God's throne, and it's surrounded by 24 elders. That's, the divine council setting there that I had touched on. And then it says that there was 4 living creatures around the outsides of the throne. Well, when you go digging through the Bible, it doesn't just flat out lay this out. You have to dig and write this stuff down and compile it like a puzzle later. But in the book of Isaiah, it says that God's throne sits on the firmament, and that earth is his footstool, and that the train of his robe goes into the temple. And so when you take that, so you have earth as the footstool, the throne, God's throne sitting on it. You have the 24 elders that gather around the divine council. Jesus says in the New Testament, is there not 12 hours in a day? So they had a concept of 24-hour day time, 12 day, 12 night. So I think that is, symbolic for time. And then it talks about these 4 living creatures. And I said, the faces mirror the Babylonian zodiac. So it's like in this vision that John's having, it's like God takes him into outer space and gets to look down at, the huge overall picture. And what does that picture show symbolically? That God is in the center of all time and space and is in control. So in the book of Revelation, you have all this crazy stuff going on, but it starts off with that vision. And it's kind of like God saying, hey, there's some chaos and some crazy stuff going on right now, but just know that I'm in control, and I'm showing you with this vision, I'm at the center of all time, space, and matter, and reign supreme. And as long as you have your green card ready for my citizenship, you have the assurance that I'm the one in control, and everything's going to be okay. So you have a hierarchy. You have all these different angels and subclasses and job titles that are within this kingdom, because you have to have all these different job functions and titles to run a proper kingdom. So the kingdom of heaven is no different. And when I've talked about Esau and the Bigfoot thing, I do want to touch on this because I've not touched on this on a podcast yet, because I get a lot of pushback, and people's like, Esau was not a Bigfoot because all the experiences that we see, there is portals, there is loss of time, there's UFOs and all this supernatural and extraterrestrial UFO, what Tony calls woo. There's all this woo surrounding Bigfoot. So therefore, Esau, a man, cannot be Bigfoot. Try again. So if you look at this from this disembodied spirit demon that used to be a Nephilim point of view, I think it works itself out, because it says in Genesis that when the angels came down and bred with the daughters of men, they created the Nephilim giants, the mighty men of old. And it says that they were on the earth before and after. And what it's talking about after is after the flood. And you got to remember, when this book was written, it wasn't written at the time. This was something that was written looking back in time. So all these oral traditions that we talked about, with the telephone game, they didn't have writing. So Moses took it upon himself to write down these oral traditions and stories that had been passed down. So the only thing we know definitively is that they were before and after the flood. So that leaves us 2 options. Either A, some survived the flood, and the repopulation of the Nephilim and the diluting of the human DNA happened, or there was a second incursion, a second set came down and done this again. And some of the arguments that you get with this is, for the first one, some survived the flood. I've heard people say, well, if you're saying that some survived the flood, you're saying that God is incompetent, or God failed. Well, if the objective was to eliminate all of them, then yes, he would have failed. But we know God cannot fail. So if some survived the flood, they were meant to. and that event was just to knock down the population low enough that humanity had a fighting chance. And then the other one is the Bible doesn't record a second incursion, so therefore it didn't happen. Well, there's lots of historical events that happened that we know. We can find, evidence in archaeology that they happened that was not recorded in the Bible. So just because something is not in the Bible doesn't mean it did not happen. Is my point of view. So if, and this is an if Esau was in fact what we would call today a Bigfoot, that means he was a hybrid being. And according to the book of Enoch, when the hybrid beings die, they are neither of earth or of heaven, so therefore their souls have no place to reside, and therefore they wander aimlessly on the earth and torment mankind. So if they are demons, they're disembodied spirits. So therefore they have abilities and capabilities that we do not have. And would it be a stretch of the imagination to say that if you had this power, would you not want to manifest in a familiar form? If you were a large, strong, hairy, mighty man and died, and you were allowed to roam around and torment mankind and take form, would you not want to take a familiar form and something that you used to be that commanded reverence, fear, and respect?
Well said. And it's a great place to wrap up and let people know exactly how to get in touch with you. And obviously Prometheus Lens is the name of the podcast. You can listen to it in all the places that you find this show. So YouTube, Spotify, Apple, all those mainstream avenues.